I felt compelled to do a reading tonight from the Mebes Tarot Majors, Arcanum 11 Force, where he looks at certain aspects of occult history and he analyses those in relation to the Shin element in various periods of time. And I'm going to read out what he says about the Templars. At the beginning of the Crusades, the marked influence of the Gnostic current in the schools of Arabia and of Palestine served as inspiration to several Crusader expeditionaries, leading them to form one of the most powerful egregores, the Templar egregore. The point above the Yod of the Templar scheme was the grand ideal of creating a universal empire, perfect and balanced on all planes, and which would introduce, everywhere, the penetration of the subtle in the dense. In this empire, the higher influx coming from the plane of the mystical power should give life to the astral power, and, by instructing and governing the director power to create prosperity, happiness, and the possibility of evolutionary work, that is, to facilitate salvation for all classes regardless of the nationalities to which they belonged. However, they should beat the local customs and the conditions of national environments. This formidable scheme included all dreams: to curb the abuses of papal power, to raise and perfect all classes of human society, to develop industry and commerce worldwide, and to end the loss of energy spent on struggles between nationalities, social classes, or individual struggles caused by ill will or mutual incomprehension. In short, it was the dream of realization of the kingdom of God on earth, cherished by conscious and intelligent men, by souls minted in chivalry, and who, to do so, relied on the support of their heavenly bodies and their honestly acquired wealth. The element Yod in the scheme of the Templars consisted of the teaching of Hermes Trismegistus, breathed by the sound influence of Gnosticism. The first He was constituted by the environment of the Crusaders, providing the new egregore with its elements more capable, stronger, pure, and spiritualized. The Shin element of the new chain formed from the beauty of the ideal, from the attractive perspective of the future power at all levels, of its supporters and the possibility that they would have to use this power in a general or particular way, in the realization of the ideals that were dear to them. The element Vow of the Templars was constituted by what today is called the Cult of Baphomet. The word Baphomet, read Kabbalistically from right to left, is the result of a particular way of adapting notaricum, to the phrase Templi omnium hominum passis abbas, which translated means the Father of the Temple of Peace for all men. This name corresponds to a personification of the manner in which the Templars realized their ideals, and which consisted of creating, with the volitional impulses of the current, a powerful astral swirl. Because of this, in the secret ceremonies of the Templars, an important role was played by a statue representing Baphomet, symbol of the astral swirl, Nebash, of which we shall speak in the Arcanum 15. The second He of the Templars corresponded to the policy of theocratic character with the preservation of hierarchical law and the principle of complete centralization. Groups of commendorias of the Templars formed priories. The latter rallied to the great priory. Groups of great priories constituted languages, that is, groups that used the same language. Above all, the language was the Grand Master. This, in the application of his pentagrammatic power, was based solely on the broad Templar motto, mercy and knowledge. On these bases, in the year 1118, the Order of the Temple was formed. We have already mentioned its dissolution later in the year 1312 by papal bull, and prior to this, on October 13, 1307, the tragic end of the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, and his closest collaborators. The powerful Yod and He elements of the Templar Igogore, along with its magnetic Shin, led the order to the summit of flowering on all planes. Its enemies, envious of this success and coveting the riches of the order, the vast territories belonging to the temple, sought ways to destroy it. Pulling back from the current's magical power, they chose a hidden weapon, slander, attacking the bow of the Igogore and accusing the Templars of practicing black magic, organising orgies and worshipping Baphomet. Tracing a real network of intrigues, they finally achieved their goal, the destruction of the order on the physical plane. But can we ask what happened to the Knights of the Temple who did not perish, who risked welcoming them, being fraternal to them? In response to this question, we must remember that, in parallel with the emergence of Templars, two other currents were created and strengthened in Europe. The Hermetic, which aspired to the great work, and that of the builders of the Gothic cathedrals, called Freemasons, who professed the cult of their work, preserving traditional symbolism in architecture. These two currents approached, creating associations composed of two types of elements, workers on the mental plane and workers on the physical plane. The link that bound them was the astral world, the world of traditional initiatory symbols, enlivened by the work of hermeticists and coagulated and expressed in accessible form and senses by the work of the Masons. It was these Freemasons, officially recognised by Rome in the year 1277, that decided to accept as brothers the Knights Templar, saved from the destruction of their order, who thus became accepted Masons. This refers to the physical plane, but what happens to the astrosome chain, its powerful Igogore? The great Igogores do not dissolve because of a disaster on the physical plane, even though by point of support on earth they have the possibility of purification and perfection in the astral plane. It could be said that the shells of these Igogores, shells that formed from the mistakes of their adepts on the physical plane, dissolve or subtilize, allowing the inner light to appear with higher intensity. The possibility of such an improvement is a privilege only of the Igogores who, speaking in terms adopted by us, have a very pure point above Yod, and the closed system of a powerful Yod very clearly determined. The Igogore of the Templars was cleansed in the astral plane for a little more than 70 or 80 years, and then gave rise to a collectivity on earth to which we will give the code name Rosicrucianism of the primary type. I do not impose on you faith in the existence of the Brotherhood, allegedly founded by Christian Rosenkreuz, 1378 to 1484, composed of a small number of mystic virgins. I just want to defend the thesis of the fact of a distinct formation in the astral of the formal side of these ideals and those ways of perfection, about which the famous Farmer Fraternitas, the Rosicrucian, interprets. Since these ideals are registered in the form of a specific code, I have the right to state the very fact of the Igogore's awakening in a much earlier era. But in what form should the Igogore of the primary Rosicrucianism be presented to us according to the mentioned composition as well as according to the confessio of the rose and the cross. It is clearly seen that this powerful egregore attracted the vibrations of three broad, rich flows of truth: Gnosticism, Kabbalah, and the Metacism of the alchemical school. The highest point of the modification of the Templar egregore, the upper point above the Yod, was the ideal of the theurgical work of the kingdom of Elias the artist, together with a firm belief in the coming of such a kingdom in the future. What does it mean? Who is the artist Elias? Where did Elias come from? And why artist? In the Bible, Elias and Enoch are symbols of something that is brought alive into heaven. However, the direct path to the empyrean of metaphysics is open only to the streams of absolute truth. The minor arcana of the Book of Enoch are part of such flows. Elias, in turn, is like the more concrete image of Enoch, is closer to us. Therefore, Elias and not Enoch. But what is Elijah? In what ways will he lead us to the minor arcana, to the Rosicrucian reintegration? Is it really by blissful, by artless hearts, by unenlightened but infinitely simple believers, Christ for the sake of holy fools? No. The egregore was not engaged in this happy but rarely encountered category of people. He had in mind the salvation of those who had time to taste the refined taste of knowledge, of sciences, and who cannot refuse the high pleasures bestowed by it. The Rosicrucian Elias leads his followers to the minor arcana by painstaking, skillful analysis of the major. He tricks, he combines, he deserves the name artist. The powerful Yod with which he impregnates his followers is displayed as an immortal symbol of the rose cross. In whatever frame you put this symbol, whatever overtones you provide to its main melody, it was, is, and will be the same in its central part. The cross, a symbol of the path of selflessness, limitless altruism, unlimited obedience to the laws of the highest, represents one of its poles. The rose of Hermes, the seductively fragrant symbol of science, proud of its three-pronged completeness, wraps around this cross. Those who are familiar with it can wear the cross, but are not able to tear the rose from it. Let her thorns prick scientists, they will not cease to enjoy its aroma. Rose is the second pole of the binary. The task of the Rosicrucian is to neutralize this binary. An adherent of Rosicrucianism should neutralize self-renunciation and science in person, combine them in the self, and be in service of one ideal, become like the third symbol placed in the considered pantacle of the foot of the cross on the rose. There is a pelican with wide wings, feeding its own meat and blood to its chicks in a fit of parental sacrifice. In the emblem, the chicks of the pelican are of different colours. In the primitive emblems, there were only 3 chicks, symbolising the 3 primordial causes. In the later emblems, there are 7, symbolising the 7 secondary causes, each of the chicks being of a different planetary colour. This indicates that the sacrifice must be made according to the science of colours, that is, each one of the chicks needs a specific treatment. Here is the true Rosicrucian Yod meditation. The first He of this Rosicrucianism, of course, was the environment of a very few selected natures inclined to combine mysticism with subtle intellectual aspirations. the Shin of the Rosicrucian scheme took on a certain self-appreciation, even self-worship, as a consequence of being considered as chosen instruments. There were so few people capable of satisfying these demands that the conviction of superiority introduced itself. It was accentuated further by the severe rules of Rosicrucian lifestyle ethics, which the elect introduced into life. The worship, the element vow, was expressed by meditation on symbols, especially on the great pentacle of the Rose and Cross, and partly by the mystical ceremonies during the meetings of the Rosicrucians. The second Hay school was the policy of secrecy of the personalities of the Rosicrucians themselves, striving to anonymously realise all that the conscience of adherents considered to be conducive to the progress of mankind, both in the field of ethics and in the field of intellect. In this second Hay, we see the shells of the Templars, which did not have time to dissolve in the pure astral plane. One can see the hatred of the Roman Church, reaching the formal generation of the elements of Protestantism. In the Fama Fraternitas and Confessio, the Pope is equated with the Antichrist. Only 2 sacraments are recognized, and so on. Of course, sharp manifestations against Rome should be recognized as a reflection of the astral revenge on Clement V. The primary Rosicrucianism could not naturally count in its ranks many adherents. Too many had to combine opposite traits in order to go to its ideals without breaking away from its developed form. Later, in the 16th century, from the initial school, gradually emerges what could be called secondary Rosicrucianism. If the first was only accessible to a very few chosen ones, the second could be followed by all conscious men, while the former tyrannically imposed certain forms of self-improvement on its adherents. The latter was distinguished by extreme tolerance in all areas accessible to the mind and heart. The highest point over the Yod and the Yod element itself remained the same. The first Hay had noticeably changed. The environment fertilised by the Rosicrucian ideas in the 16th, 17th and partly in the 18th centuries was an aggregate of encyclopedias in the broadest and best sense of the word. It required only the versatility in intellectual aspirations, the ability to scientifically speculate, the breadth of views and devotion to the idea of good. This included highly mystical natures and inveterate pantheists and people of practical aspirations. But, I repeat, only people who were remarkable in their intelligence and erudition, who had personal will and certainty in their views on the coming humanity, were taken. The publication of the Shin element was not authorized by the Master Mebes. The element of vow was the ritual of initiation of the members of the chain in the degree of Rosicrucianism defined in general terms, but with differences between different schools, the ritual formalities of the general meetings of the Supreme Teacher Councils of one or another branch of the egregore. If you want, this includes the methods of astral processing and training of the personality, which have joined to the main process of meditation and are borrowed for the most part from different Eastern schools. The second Hay of the system under study became a special policy of influencing society, firstly of a purely ethical nature, and later on of a strongly implementing one. The divisions and subdivisions of the second Rosicrucianism had different political mottos in different eras. These mottos dealt with the next major political or religious reform. But the Templar egregore, the bearer of the edifying cliché of the fall of the Jacques de Molay chain in the physical plane, vibrated to caution every time the Rosicrucianism was about to take one or another decisive step, and inspired it to the adherence of the scheme of the surest and safest way to influence society. The result of one of these vibrations was the foundation of the so-called Masonic order. The thin astral of the Rosicrucianism, very suitable for teaching, could get confused in solving practical issues, could show a lack of tact in the field of juggling with everyday conditions, could suffer essentially from a direct encounter with the trifles of everyday life. And so, a corporeal shell has been created, the soul of which is Rosicrucianism, but which is hardened in everyday affairs and is not afraid of hard work. This shell is Freemasonry. I mean the orthodox Freemasonry of the Scottish ritual, with an ethical and hermetic interpretation of traditional symbolism. It will preserve the very symbols, maintain in its midst and in public respect for the symbols themselves and their interpreters, the Rosicrucians, and based on this respect, inspire everyone, that a good example of the relative purity of the Masonic manners has as its starting point the very content of the initiation teachings. Freemasonry carried out the reforms decided by the Rosicrucians, protecting them with their own people against possible hostility and human persecution on the physical plane. The founders of Freemasonry, along with Elias Ashmole, 1617-1692, occupies a prominent place, with great skill adapted for its use, the system of the Mason's 3 degrees, making it the basis of his own first 3 degrees, the symbolism of initiation Freemasonry. This work began in 1646, and in 1717 there was already a fully organised system of chapters of the Scottish Masonry. Thus, Freemasonry has become an indispensable tool in the work of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, whose politics, the second He, received the name Mason, a name that it has kept so far. The effects of Rosicrucian policy achieved by Freemasons in the external world were called cannon shots. Among other such cannon shots were considered the religious reforms of Luther and Calvin, as well as the liberation of the United States of America from the British dependence. The Rosicrucian used Masons, especially since among them were those they chose who deserved to be initiated into Christian enlightenment. However, each medal has its reverse. While Freemasonry was an organisation submitted to Rosicrucianism, while practising the principle of hierarchical succession by transmission, it did its job, and there were no problems. Unfortunately, several very strong branches resolved to introduce the method of electing its leaders, thus rejecting the traditional hierarchical principle. As a result, the Masonic work began to change its character, and from evolutionary it became almost revolutionary. An important moment in this new direction was the descent of Lacan and his followers in 1773, who in a split separated themselves from legitimate Masonry and founded a new association that became known under the name of the Grand Orient of France. With this we will conclude our brief sketch on Freemasonry and move on to the end of the 17th century to analyse one of the currents still existing of the old Christian Enlightenment. Around the year 1760, the famous Martinis de Pascali founded a fraternity of servants of the sacred, the G.O.M, with 9 hierarchical degrees. The 3 degrees were Rosicrucian. The school of Martinez was a magical theurgist, with a strong predominance of purely magical methods. After his death, his 2 favourite disciples, J.B. Willermoz and Louis-Claude Saint Martin, altered the character of this chain. Willermoz gave him a Masonic colouring, and Saint Martin, a writer known under his pseudonym, the Unknown Philosopher, sent the chain the mystical, theurgical way. Contrary to Willermoz, he favoured a liberal initiation and not the rules of the Masonic lodges. The influence of Saint Martin predominated and gave rise to a movement called Martinism. The egregore of the original Martinism, which had its own Freemasonry and was firmly incarnated in all European countries, was composed approximately according to the following scheme. The highest point over Yod is reconciliation with oneself in the ethical field. Yod is a spiritualistic philosophy of the works of St. Martin, which varied somewhat during different periods of his life. The first He consisted of a set of very pure and disinterested people, possessing more or less pronounced mystical aspirations, people ready for any philanthropic work. The Shin element, in fact, was not, probably depending on the nature of the first He. Pure idealists do not need magnets to bait fans, since they aspire to an internal reconciliation with conscience. The vow element boiled down to a very simple ritual of prayer and the initiation ceremony, distinguished by its extreme simplicity. Among the Freemasons of the Martinists were some who gave more importance to the ritual, and this, in certain lodges, became even more imposing by its magnificence. However, we now emphasize pure independent Martinism of any Masonic addition or affiliation. In Martinism, all value was given to meditation, to formation of the man of aspiration, and not to the magical environment, as was the case in the Martinism of Willamos. The second He of old Martinism was the philanthropic impulses of its members, the inexpressible help of the poor and dejected, the lack of desire to cheat when confronted with external influences, and the kind of steady modesty that greatly impressed all layers of modern Martinism of society. The Martinis Initiation during the period of the First Empire and subsequent eras into the 80s of the 19th century, whilst transmitted by a very tenuous link, on the other hand, counts in its ranks very respectable persons. In the 80s, the well-known Stanislav Guaita started an attempt to update the esoteric movement and created the Kabbalistic order of the Cross and Rose, according to the following scheme. The point over the Yod is the reconciliation of the academic official science with the complex of esoteric teachings available to our time, with the aim of fruitful joint work of representatives of both movements. Yod is a synthesis of all the traditions available to our research, plus a set of experimental techniques that have arisen in recent times and greatly facilitate many ways of research. Unfortunately, the first He again turned out to be the environment of encyclopedists, but of the unsuccessful encyclopedists in our era. Capable people move quickly in their specialty and often do not have time to develop diversely in others. People who are disappointed in their special careers sometimes push themselves into encyclopedia with this very disappointment, which allows them to scatter in class and appear to superficial observers as multifaceted intellectuals, thus resembling the really exceptional people as were the members of early Rosicrucianism. The Shin element of the new egregore was a seductive prospect for equal rights with the recognised leaders of academic science by virtue of their Rosicrucian privileges. The element of vow was the work of reprinting, translating and commenting on classical works of occultism, which by that time had become bibliographic rarities, almost unaffordable for the price of even a wealthy man in the street. In this regard, the Paris Rosicrucians brought many benefits to lovers of the occult and deserve the greatest gratitude from all who honour the great monument of the traditions. The worst element of the system was the second He, manifested as a political opportunist in order to attract the university world. The traditional theses and their explanation were altered to make them agree with the latest scientific works, thus losing their value. The commitment of certain Rosicrucians to obtain the approval of representatives of official science naturally impaired the prestige of the school. On the other hand, attempts by a part of the membership to mitigate the Rosicrucian theses in order not to run counter to the Roman Church led to a split within the school itself, the removal of Peladon. In general, still in the time of Stanislas de Guaita, the situation became precarious, and therefore an attempt was made to approach Freemasonry, which, misrepresenting the purposes of the order, precipitated its fall. It still exists, but rather weakened. In parallel with the formation of the Kabbalistic Order of the Cross and Rose, Guaita made an attempt to revive the initiatory movement on a large scale, which was examined under the name of Martinism. The Neo-Martinism of Stanislas de Guaita became quite different from the initial stream, however. Neo-Martinism adopted the Martinist ritual of initiation to the degree of superior inconnu, and in this ritual he based his symbolism. The ideals of St. Martin under the internal formation of the man of desire could not satisfy the energetic Guaita, who was too drawn to the visible results. He did not voluntarily interrupt external activity, even when necessary to magnetize the environment. In his works there are often ironic words about such interruptions. So that the almost reborn egregore of Martinez de Pascali could bring to the new order of the Cross and Rose adepts chosen from the most capable superior inconnu of the new Martinism, it was necessary to introduce in the scheme of its great tolerance in the dogmatic field. The point above the Yod of the new scheme is still the formal motto of the ethical reconciliation of man with himself. The choice of the element Yod was left to the free will of each member of the Neo-Martinist stream. Of course, the works of St. Martin retained their leading role. Due to the choice of Yod, the He element turned out to be the most diverse and multicoloured. Here, weary and tired of religious pursuit and disappointed in academic science, simply curious and longing for the likeness of Freemasonry, but unable to get into other associations and ambitious in the field of seeking external signs of mystical power, and lovers of conversations on occult topics in crowded circles, and hysterics, always inclined to join associations, surrounding themselves with an element of mystery, and finally, firmly aware that an uneven student chain is better for them than a complete lack of egregorical support. Since the Cross and Rose put in their chain and are setting the candidates to pass the 3 degrees of Neo-Martinism, the representatives of the latter always included several people who deserved to become teachers of the uneven Martinist chain, man, desire, and properly direct the development of their abilities, which should be considered the basis of the survivability of the order, after Guaita has noticeably grown and still has a large number of adherents. At the head of the Supreme Martinist Council is now a very prominent figure in the promotion of occultism through the press, which is Gerardin Cow's papers. Due to the diversity in tendencies and the degree of ethical development of the members of the Martinist chain, the Shin element is a variety of different lures. One is attracted by the ritual, the other is solidarity with the links of the chain, the third is the possibility of expanding esoteric development, the fourth is the purity of the continuity of power in the chain of Martinez de Pascali. The vow element, in addition to the mystical ceremonies uniting the Martinists, consisted of meditation and, facilitating these meditations, instructors' lectures addressing initiatory issues. The second He is a rather passive policy of waiting for the phases of ethical improvement of society and the impact on such good examples of life in good faith. Of course, it cannot be categorically affirmed that not a single Martinist circle attaches to this policy a more active element of a philanthropic or other nature. But these, I repeat, are particular phenomena, and I do not dare to introduce them into the framework of the analysis of Euclidean principles. I will save the listeners from a detailed analysis of other current trends, but will allow myself to cite the names of secret societies with which my venerable listeners may meet with members under certain circumstances. Without listing the Masonic rituals except the Orthodox Scottish 33 degrees, Memphis 97 degrees, Miss Rome 96 degrees, French 7 degrees, I will draw your attention to the order of the German Illuminati, philanthropy and national politics, which is close in design to the Masonic scheme, to the Asian Rosicrucians, a solid acquaintance with esotericism and bold international politics, to the English Rose Cross Esoterica, the study of esotericism under the very strictly conducted Rosicrucian ritual, and finally, the existence of many circles of a more or less Rosicrucian type, of which some are not worth mentioning by their insignificance, while others are not allowed to be listed due to their categorically expressed desire not to be mentioned in the press and not to remove the curtain of secrecy. Brotherhoods of this type call themselves in correspondence nothing more than initials, and do not reveal the names of their leaders to anyone. I made some notes about the Shin element of secondary Rosicrucianism, which Mebes did not authorise to be published, and which I've been thinking about long and hard, and I'm not sure if these notes are in any way relevant or explanatory or on the mark anymore, or if ever, but I'll read them anyway. We have naturally mused long and hard on the possible essence of the Shin teaching, which G.O.M. prohibited as far as publication of his book was concerned, but which he must have revealed to his inner circle. As the aspect of Shin described in the preceding section on the original Rosicrucian organisation related to the character of involved individuals, it seems possible that the same rule applies in the second part. Could it be related to the emergence of an individual who embodied the Shin force with either positive or negative results or intentions? Names which spring to mind include Sabbatai Zevi, Rasputin. Noted that there's a significant time difference between the two, although you might contend that they're in the same spiritual stream. On the other hand, perhaps it is connected with a branch of black magic which G.O.M. does not wish to strengthen by revealing one of its entrances. Or it could have dangerously touched on the contemporary political situation in Russia, bearing in mind he was writing shortly before the Bolshevik Revolution, teaching shortly before then. So there could have been, it could have been either a red magical force, the Red Russians, the Bolsheviks, or it could have been the dark side of the White Russian faction, the right wing, the hard right and the hard left. We're speculating, and have also considered that Shin was repressed in this section of the Arcana because of its proximity to the Holy of Holies and united relationship between the divine and enlivened human wills, which may be signified by the four-pronged Shin, wherein the fourth prong of the fork represents the human being connected with the three-pronged fire of the Holy Trinity. To be continued.